All the Young Dudes, Sirius's Perspective by Rollercosterwords. Chapter 38, Second Year, The Long Last Day, Part 1. Friday the 29th of June, 1973. "Do you think we'll be able to pull it off?" James asked, stifling a yawn. They were lying side by side on their backs, staring up at the heavy red drapes surrounding the bed. Sirius scoffed. "Of course we will. We're marauders, aren't we?" The silencing spell around the bed muffled the outside sounds slightly, but he still heard the clock strike midnight. It was officially their final day at Hogwarts. "We certainly are," James grinned, closing his eyes. His voice was beginning to take on that sluggish, dreamy quality that it usually did right before he fell asleep. Sirius shuffled a little, jostling him, and his eyes fluttered back open. He mumbled drowsily. Sirius hesitated. There was something he needed to say. Something he'd been meaning to talk to James about, a seed of fear that had grown slowly over the past few months, worming sickly roots into his mind. But it had never felt like the right time, and honestly, the thought of speaking the words aloud made him feel as though they might come true. James mumbled, "Reckon we should—" He broke off into a yawn. "To bed, yeah? Got an early morning tomorrow?" "Yeah," Sirius nodded. "Yeah, right." But he didn't move. Everything okay?" James was staring at him, clearly fighting to keep his eyelids from drooping. He was obviously about to pass out. Sirius took a quick breath and opened his mouth. "I don't know if I'm coming back." The words came out in a rush, spilling into one another. James sat up, blinking. "What?" Do you remember? My mum threatened to send me to Durmstrang." "Yeah, but you don't think she might." James opened and closed his mouth like a fish, unsure of what to say. Sirius could see that it had been the last thing his friend was expecting to hear. He spoke quickly, trying to explain. "It's just, the betrothal and everything, it's a big deal, a big ceremony, and once they've announced it to everyone, they'll need to make sure that I don't know, ruin it somehow." "How could you ruin it by coming back to Hogwarts?" James demanded, indignant. "You'd already be, Sirius looked down at his hands, fiddling with his fingers. "You don't know what my parents are like. Everything's about appearances with them. If they announce it to the entire wizarding world that the Black family heir is engaged, it'll be like everyone's suddenly watching." "But that's ridiculous." "I know. I mean, who do they think even cares that much about what you do? I don't know. Where is this even coming from?" "I thought you said Durmstrang was an empty threat." Sirius sighed helplessly. "I know. I thought it was, since she was just sending me howlers, but, I had sort of a conversation with Reg." "What? When?" A few months ago." James looked hurt. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sirius shrugged, looking away. For a tense moment there was a silence, and James reached out and grasped his shoulder. "I won't let them send you away." His voice was low, urgent. "No matter what. Okay?" Sirius swallowed the lump in his throat. "Okay," he whispered, wishing he could believe it. The next morning he woke up early, as promised. The Marauders' final mission would take the entire day, and require them to sneak in and out of every bathroom on every floor of the castle. He and James would be in charge of spellcasting, and had already divvied up all the targets that they needed to hit. They had decided that it would be best for them to remain conspicuously separated all day to avoid suspicion. Peter and Remus were still asleep as the other boys headed down for breakfast, which wasn't surprising. Peter always forgot his alarm, and Remus was slow and grumpy in the mornings. Sirius finished his own food quickly, anxious to get started with his task. James was still eating, so he took time to make a plate for Remus, coating 4 thick slices of toast with 4 different spreads, the way he liked. Halfway through the meal, Peter came scurrying down to join them. Sirius frowned at the entrance to the Great Hall. "Where's Lupin?" "He was just waking up when I came down," Peter said, around a mouthful of fried egg. "It's probably going to be a bit." "He'll miss breakfast at this rate," Sirius muttered, standing. "I'll just take this to him." Back in the dorm, the bathroom door was shut. Sirius checked the clock. He didn't have time to hang about, so he knocked and called out, "Toast here for you, Moony. Thought I'd save you some time." "Oh, great. Cheers," Remus answered through the door. "Good luck. See you this afternoon." Yeah, you too. He needed to stop by McGonagall's office and drop off his timetable before he got started on his mission, so he paused on his way down to the hall to knock on her door. There was a sharp sound of footsteps, and it swung open a moment later. "Mr. Black?" She peered down her nose through her spectacles. He grinned. "My timetable, Professor." McGonagall plucked the paper from his hand, scanning it. "Arithmancy. One of the most difficult subjects we offer at Hogwarts. But I've no doubt you can handle it, if you choose to apply yourself." She raised an eyebrow meaningfully, and went back to reading the paper. "Divination and Muggle studies." McGonagall glanced up, surveying him for a moment with pursed lips. Her stern look typically made students shrink away. McGonagall was one of the strictest professors at Hogwarts, with a zero tolerance for mischief, disruption, or tomfoolery. Her classes were notoriously difficult. Her tests left little room for error. As she eyed him, Sirius stood up straighter. He would never admit it, but she was his favourite professor. "Are these your final decisions?" "Yes, Professor." He nodded firmly. She waved her hand absently, sending the paper floating over her shoulder to her desk. "Well, go on then. Run along." As he started to leave, she said, "And Mr. Black, stay out of trouble." Her severe expression had softened. Her eyes twinkled as she said it. He smiled, the picture of innocence. "Yes, Professor." Sirius felt as though his legs might fall off. He'd spent the past hour tromping around the castle on the upper floors, going up and down stairs, in and out of each bathroom. He had had to use detection spells outside each one to make sure they were empty. He couldn't have someone catching him in the middle of his incantations. It wasn't difficult magic, but it was time-consuming. After climbing what felt like his 5th set of stairs, Sirius paused, trying to gasp for breath quietly as possible. He had the invisibility cloak, which made it less likely to be discovered, but he didn't want his heavy breathing to give him away. Once his heart had stopped pounding, he muttered the detection spell outside the 6th floor boys' bathroom, craning his neck to check the clock on the opposite wall. He needed to hurry down to the 1st floor soon to pass off the cloak to James, who was in charge of getting all the bathrooms on the lower levels of the castle. So far, everything was going according to plan. James and Peter had gone off to infiltrate the kitchens after breakfast, where they would be laying down the groundwork for the Marauder's spell that night. Once that was done, James would take the invisibility cloak from Sirius and finish off the bathrooms. Peter would then collect the cloak from James, using it to transport any magical cleaning supplies from Filch's cupboard, the only thing that might foil phase 1 of their plan. Outside, where Remus would be waiting, Peter would hide the supplies and pass the cloak off to Remus, who would steal all the umbrellas from the storage shed and hide them in the dorm room. After that, it was only a matter of enjoying the chaos and preparing for phase 2. Sirius took the stairs 2 at a time, rushing to make sure he wasn't late for his meeting with James. He slowed down as he neared the empty classroom they had selected, waiting until the hallway was clear to knock. The door opened immediately, revealing James's grinning face. "Did you finish?" he whispered, hardly able to contain his enthusiasm. Sirius pushed past and shut the door behind him, flinging off the cloak. "Of course I finished." He tossed his hair. "Now it's your turn. How'd things go in the kitchens?" "Perfectly." James took off his cloak and outstretched his hands. "Marvellously, wondrously, magnificent. Okay, I get the picture." Sirius shook his head, laughing. James smiled impishly, swinging the cloak from around his shoulders, so that it looked like his head was floating mid-air. Before he could finish his disappearing act, Sirius said casually, "And we're sure Peter's okay, with the closet and whatnot?" "Yes," James answered emphatically. "Have a little faith, Black. He's a marauder too." I know, Sirius assured him, backtracking hastily. He wasn't entirely comfortable on delegating such a responsibility to Peter. He was worried about the anxious boy would back out before he actually had to break into Filch's closet. But he didn't want to get into a fight with James on their last day of Hogwarts. His frequent disdain of the smallest marauder was still a bit of a sore spot between him and James, though Sirius thought he'd gotten better about reining in his snarky comments. After all, he did consider Peter a friend now, but they would never be as close with each other as either one of them was with James. "Wish me luck." The floating head disappeared. The whisper appeared to be coming from an empty classroom. "Good luck," Sirius whispered back, turning to open the door. He kept it ajar a moment longer than he normally would, making sure James had time to slip out untouched before he closed it. "Sirius!" He spun around, shutting the door quickly. Mary and Marlene were walking down the hallway, arms linked together. It was Mary who'd called his name, and she flashed him a pearly smile. "Oh, hi, Mary." "Hiya." She stopped in front of him, still linked with Marlene. Sirius nodded. "McKinnon? Black? What were you doing in there?" Mary peered over his shoulder, as if she could see through the door. "Nothing." "Really?" She dragged the word out skeptically, with a playful smirk. "Is Potter around, then?" "No." "Oh, he is, isn't he? Come on, then. What are you two up to? Is he hiding in there?" "No," Sirius snapped, starting to get a bit annoyed. "Have a look, if you're so curious." She giggled blithely, unfazed by his tone, and reached around to push the door open. Marlene was silent, blushing furiously next to her friend. Empty." Mary let the door swing shut. "But I think you're still up to something." Sirius shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, and tucked his hair behind one ear. "I'm always up to something." He knew it was something Remus and James would laugh at him for saying, but it sounded cooler in his head. Mary just giggled again, so he changed the subject. "Where are you two headed?" Marlene shrugged her shoulder and gestured to the books nestled in her right arm, the left still intertwined with Mary's right. At the same time, Mary chirped, "Library! Off to return books, or else Madame Pince will have our heads." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "I heard from a 5th year that those screaming books in the restricted section are actually the souls of students that she trapped when they didn't return their books on time." Sirius laughed. He liked Mary. She was actually pretty funny when she wasn't being annoying. The laughter seemed to boost the girl's confidence. She leaned forwards and poked him in the arm, teasing. "You haven't got anything overdue, have you? Wouldn't want you to end up trapped in one of those sleeves forever." The smile slid from his face, and he considered the question. "Actually, now you mention it, I've got some I'd completely forgot." "Oh, well, we can't have that." Mary spun around, beckoning him. "Come on, you can pick them up in the dorm and come with us to the library." Next to her, Marlene frowned. "We're going back to the Gryffindor Tower." "It's all right, really, you don't need to." Mary shushed him, cutting him off, and gave Marlene a gentle slap on the arm. "Don't be silly. Wouldn't want you to get lonely on the last day of term." She set off, leaving him with no choice but to follow. Chapter 39, 2nd Year, The Long Last Day, Part 2. Sirius didn't exactly want Mary and Marlene following him up to their room. Remus's birthday had been a special occasion, but it would be weird to have girls in his room if his friends weren't there, so he told them to wait in the common room while he went to grab his books. Marlene looked a bit put out, but Mary dragged her over to sit down on one of the couches all the same. Sirius raced upstairs, trying to stifle his irritation with Mary. He did need to return the library books at some point, and they still had some time while James finished up the end of the prank, but he wanted to make sure that he was out in the halls to witness it when their work finally paid off that morning. Unfortunately, he hadn't exactly left his room in perfect order. It looked like Remus had tried to pack a bit that morning. His bed was entirely devoid of anything except his pyjamas, and James, who was the tidiest of all of them, had already made his bed and neatly packed his trunk. Peter's area was still a mess, clothes half packed and trunk flung open, as if he'd been interrupted halfway through trying to tidy his things away. Unlike his friends, Sirius hadn't even begun to pack. His records were sprawled out all over the floor, his posters were still up, and his clothes lay in haphazardous piles. Books, quills, papers, stray gobstones, chocolate frog cards, and various other items were strewn about, cluttering his space. He sighed in frustration, glancing at the clock again as he began frantically searching for his forgotten library books. There were 3 of them, all related to Transfiguration, all checked out in hopes that they would contain some information helpful to his animagus pursuits. Sirius felt a twinge of guilt whenever he thought about how little headway he'd made on his research over the past year. While he'd spent quite a bit of time looking into the theory behind animagi magic, he hadn't had the patience to do a deep dive into the potion ingredients they'd need. Sirius knew that he'd probably have to delegate ample time to looking up each individual ingredient, where it could be found, and how it could be properly collected. He'd told himself he'd had plenty of time, but now, on the last day of term, he hadn't even started. He had resolved to spend the entire summer researching as he tore apart his trunk, tossing out nearly everything inside, onto the floor, the bed, until finally he found his last book, abandoned in the bottom corner. He checked the clock again. Everything had gone according to plan. It was only a matter of minutes before their prank began. Sirius tossed his book into his satchel and ran down the stairs, where Mary and Marlene were still waiting in the common room. "Oh, there you are!" Mary bounced up from the couch. "We were just beginning to wonder if we'd have to come and check on you." Marlene stood more slowly, a sullen expression on her face. "Sorry," Sirius said quickly, hurrying towards the portrait hall. "I had to find them all. Let's go." "Someone's in a rush." Mary shot him a bemused smile, but she looked delighted as he grabbed her arm to pull her out into the corridor. Marlene followed behind them, staring at the floor. Sirius tried to contain his excitement as they walked down the hall towards the library. Mary was chattering about something, but he was hardly listening to her, too busy glancing at every clock and every bathroom doorway that they passed, any minute now. Suddenly Marlene gave a little shriek and stopped short. Sirius spun around. He'd been craning his neck to look at the clock on the wall. His face split into a broad grin. Further down the hall, huge waves of pink foam were spilling from the boys' bathrooms. Along with Marlene, there were a few other explanations of surprise. "What is that? Ugh! Hurry, get away!" Sirius laughed, unable to contain himself, and Mary narrowed her eyes. "Are those bubbles?" The other students in the hall, once the initial shock had passed, were beginning to investigate as well, giggling as they approached the massive mounds of foam. Pink bubbles fizzed and popped as they hit the air, only to be instantly replaced by new ones. Every tap inside every bathroom in the castle was spilling out with identical mountains of rosy froth. "Is that what you were up to?" Mary demanded, sounding delighted. "Of course not," Sirius said with mock indignance. "I would never deface school property in such a manner." "If you would even suggest that—" "Oi!" Mary had interrupted him with a handful of pink foam, flung like a snowball to splat directly in his face. Sirius spluttered, rubbing away the bubbles, which left his skin damp and smelling slightly of strawberries. Even Marlene was giggling now. The sour look melted off her face. "Oh, you've gone and done it now, MacDonald," he yelled, grinning. "Just you wait." He flung his satchel over to one side, using both hands to gather up the foam, and Mary shrieked and danced away, trying to avoid the bubbly assault. Pretty soon the other students were joining in, until the hallway had become immersed in a full-fledged foam war. It wasn't until almost an hour later, cheeks flushed and clothes still wet from the bubbles, that the three Gryffindors finally arrived at the library. Madame Pince glared furiously as they passed over their books, covers slightly damp despite their attempts at drying spells. For a moment, Sirius almost believed Mary's story about trapping the souls of students. The dour old librarian certainly looked as if she was ready to trap them forever in the pages of their precious books. Fortunately, she let them go, hissing warnings about making sure they returned any future checkouts in pristine condition. Mary let out a breathless laugh as they made their way back to the dorm. Sirius expected her to split off with Marlene once they got back to the common room, but instead she asked, "What are you up to now?" She proceeded to wait expectantly for an answer. Sirius glanced around, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't that he didn't want to keep hanging out with Mary. He'd actually had quite a bit of fun with her and Marlene, which surprised him, but, well, he only had a few hours before he had to start getting ready for their grand finale at dinner, and even though they'd agreed the Marauders should remain separate, Sirius was sort of hoping to find James. After all, it was their last day before summer, and then, well, Sirius didn't want to think about what might happen after the summer. Luckily, Mary misread his hesitation, smiling mischievously. "You're still coming up with something, aren't you?" Sirius blinked, then smirked. "I'm afraid that I can neither confirm or deny your accusation." "Oh, what will it be?" "Never mind, don't tell me. I love surprises." She grabbed her friend's arm, saying enthusiastically, "See you at dinner," before the two of them headed off to their own room. Marlene gave him a tentative smile and a little wave over her shoulder, which he returned. "Oi, Black! Don't tell me you're abandoning us for that lot too." Sirius turned, grinning, to see James climbing through the portrait hole. His hair was a mess, sticking out crazily, and his glasses were slightly askew. Judging from the dampness of his robes, he had also been taking advantage of their phone prank. "It is a curse being this beautiful." Sirius flipped his hair out of his face, smirking. "The ladies just can't stay away." James snorted. "Keep telling yourself that, mate. Hey, have you seen Peter?" "Nope." "Damn, I told him to be back here to pack, but I can't find him anywhere. Probably got lost on that moving staircase again." James laughed. "Yeah, probably." He looked away briefly, and then back. "You know, I could help you pack, too. I really don't mind." "No!" Sirius frowned. James had been subtly, at least what he thought was subtly, hinting that Sirius should probably get started on packing for about the last week, and Sirius had staunchly refused every time. They still had all night, and he wanted to take advantage of his final day at Hogwarts. "It's just that it's our last day, and we probably won't have time in the morning." "No! Just drop it, okay?" Sirius snapped without meaning to. James hesitated, studying his face. "All right, mate. No packing. Got it." There was a moment of tense silence. Sirius kicked himself, mentally, for making things awkward. Why couldn't he just control his temper? Why couldn't James just mind his own damn bloody business? Anger prickled under his skin, and he was about to open his mouth again when... "Fancy a turn around on the grounds, then?" James smiled, belligerently, acting as if he could sense his friend's dark mood. "Perfect day for flying. I think I saw some of the other students grabbing their brooms. Reckon we could get enough people together for a quick game of Quidditch?" Sirius grinned, anger receding immediately. "What are we waiting for, then?" The tension broke, and they raced upstairs to grab their brooms. James always knew exactly what to say. Sirius spent 2 glorious hours speeding across the Quidditch pitch, wind in his hair and sun on his skin. True to his word, James had managed to gather a group of students for an impromptu game, and Madame Hooch had even let them use one of the quaffles in the game shed, though she'd refused to release any snitches or bludgers. Still, they had a fantastic time chasing after each other and trying to score goals. Peter found them eventually, and though he seemed self-conscious about filling in as keeper when it wasn't just the 3 of them, he finally acquiesced after much reassurance from James. Eventually the game broke up, and James made a half-hearted excuse about needing to return to the castle. Sirius was pretty sure he was going to pack for him. James Potter, excellent at many things, but lying wasn't one of them. The boy didn't have a dishonest bone in his body, and it was a wonder he could keep secrets at all. And likely only possible because of the fierce loyalty he had towards his friends. Even so, Sirius couldn't find it in himself to be angry. The earlier spat felt ridiculous, now that he was outside in the sunshine, and he knew that James was just trying to help. So he didn't question the flimsy excuse, instead simply electing to stay outside and continue flying. His parents had confiscated his broom in the past as a punishment, so there was no telling if he'd have the chance to practice his flying over the summer. Surprisingly, Peter decided to stay outside too, declaring that he'd spent too much time cooped up in the castle. Sirius suspected that his decision was motivated in part by fear of Filch, who had been raging through the halls over the pink foam and swearing revenge on whoever had stolen his cleaning supplies. He was a bit worried that it might be awkward, but flying with Peter was actually quite nice. A few other students remained on the pitch with them, and they had a game of racing from one end to the other. Without James to compete against, Sirius won every time. It almost got boring. Peter didn't seem upset that he kept losing, happy to be included, and he followed along willingly with all of Sirius's suggestions. By the time they were headed back to the castle, Sirius was beginning to think fondly to himself that maybe the boy wasn't so bad, though his tendency to whinge was still quite annoying. They returned with James and Remus to the common room, before making their way down to the great hall. The Gryffindor boys were some of the first students there, huddling on a bench and whispering to each other to make sure everyone was still on the same page for their final prank of the year. Listening to the others recount their days, it sounded as if everything had gone without a hitch. Sirius was practically bouncing in his seat with excitement as the other students began to filter in. Mary and Marlene sat down a little ways from them, and Mary flashed him an excited smile, which Sirius returned. The feast was amazing. As usual, the house elves have outdone themselves with the pudding, and Sirius felt sated and happy as the final scraps vanished from their plates. Ravenclaw had won the house cup that year, so the hall was decked out in entirely royal blue and bronze silk banners that shimmered in the flickering candlelight, making Sirius feel a bit like he was underwater. He turned away from the waving banners to watch as Dumbledore stood and made his way to the podium, beaming out at the students. "What a wonderful year it has been," he began, voice ringing out and silencing any lingering chatter. "I am immensely proud of you all, of course. Now we are all well fed, I have a few words I would like to say." "Ready, lads," Sirius whispered, feeling as though he might burst with excitement. Dumbledore continued, "Congratulations, once again, to Ravenclaw. Now, for winning this year's house—" A shriek from the far end of the hall cut off the headmaster's voice abruptly, and everyone spun around to look. Gasps of shock could be heard as every single goblet on the Ravenclaw table simultaneously erupted in fountains of red and gold bubbles. They shot towards the ceiling like geysters, bursting and showering bright droplets onto the students below, staining everything they touched with streaks of Gryffindor crimson. "Keep going!" Sirius whispered eagerly, as his friends flicked their wands together, concentrating with a single-minded determination on their joint task. Immediately, every other goblet on every other table erupted in identical streams of red and gold. Around them, students shrieked and ducked for cover. Their robes, hair, and skin dyed with violent streaks of red and gold. Even the students at the Gryffindor table found themselves showered in their own house colours. James had insisted on it. Somehow Lily Evans had gotten her hands on an umbrella, and Marlene and Mary fought to cram underneath it as they laughed. Sirius grinned, tilting his head back so that the droplets streaked into his hair, staining the inky black curls with a shimmering gold. When he looked over at the Slytherin table, he was met with Narcissa's furious glare. The red and gold easily stained her pale skin and hair. Sirius grinned back at her, tilting his chin up and laughing as a droplet of red splashed against his cheek. "Omnis Statum," Dumbledore said calmly, aiming his wand at the ceiling. At once the bubbles burst, evaporating into nothing, as if someone had opened a giant invisible umbrella over the great hall. "Scurrify!" The headmaster smiled pleasantly, now turning to wave his wand over the entire hall. The red and gold paint vanished without a trace. Not a single mark was left anywhere. The chaos dissipated, and the students retook their seats. "Ah," James sighed, disappointed. "An excellent way to celebrate Gryffindor's victory on the Quidditch pitch this year." Dumbledore cleared his throat, reclaiming the attention of the room. "And while I welcome and encourage displays of house pride, I would like everyone to remember that true sportsmanship lies in one's ability to gracefully cade victory. Please join me in raising our glasses to Ravenclaw, winners of the Hogwarts House Cup 1973. Sirius might have rolled his eyes if he hadn't been in such a good mood. Instead, he clapped gamely with the rest of the other students, thinking privately to himself that there were much cooler things than winning the House Cup. James leaned forwards, whispering, "Brilliant, bloody brilliant. We'll have to do something really big next year to top that." Sirius grinned and leaned in too, brainstorming in hushed voices with his friend. Next to him, Remus was smiling, and Peter nodded along as he and James shot back ideas. For a moment, Sirius felt himself forget his worries, forget that he might not be returning to Hogwarts in the autumn. For the moment, everything was perfect, and he let himself pretend that things were never going to change. Chapter 40. Summer 1973. Sirius had never liked the portraits adorning the walls of his ancestral home. They were all of stuffy old relatives, always frowning, and the whole lot of them were notorious snitches. But usually they wouldn't deign to speak with the likes of him, instead turning up their noses and shooting him dirty looks, which were easy to ignore once you got used to it. It was no longer the case as of the summer of 1973. When Sirius arrived home, he was horrified to find that in addition to his mother's usual vicious lecture, the portraits of his ancestors had decided to take it upon themselves to remind him what a disgrace he was. He could barely leave his room without hearing a snide remark about how he was bringing shame to his family. Sirius wished he could use magic. He and James had been cooking up a spell to temporarily change the appearance of paintings. He would have quite liked to turn his great-aunt mural into a silky, or perhaps a troll. Regardless, the vocal disapproval of his family only made Sirius more determined to prove how much he didn't care about a single word any of them said. The day after he arrived home, he immediately unpacked his Gryffindor banners and flags that he had stuffed into his trunk, hanging them all up on his wall with spello tape. He felt a bit better once his bedroom was draped with red and gold. He could almost pretend that he was back in the Gryffindor common room. The respite didn't last long. Creature must have seen the paraphernalia when he came to clean and told Sirius's mother, because within 20 hours she was tearing everything down and shredding it with magic. She forced Sirius to carry the scraps out into the back garden, then handed him a box of matches and told him to burn it. He refused. Once his legs had healed and he was able to make the trek to the family owlery again, Sirius began writing regular letters to his friends. This was a much-needed distraction, especially because Remus was actually writing back this summer. Apparently Lily Evans, of all people, had enchanted some sort of clever paper so that he could use it to read. This bothered Sirius. He was supposed to be the only one that knew Remus's secret, so he didn't understand why he'd gone and told Lily. But he tried not to think about it too much, because it was nice to be able to communicate with his friend. The letters made the next few weeks of summer bearable. James complained constantly about boredom. Remus reported that he was spending all his time doing homework, and Peter announced that his family was going to visit France. Sirius would smuggle the missives covertly into his room, where he would clutch the paper and imagine he could hear his friends' voices, and that they were all back together once more. Halfway through July, his mother intercepted a letter from James. She was predictably furious that Sirius was still in contact with that Potter whelp. His father got involved this time, lecturing in a low, dangerous voice that made Sirius feel as if ants were crawling up and down his spine. "The Potters are not your friends, son," he said coldly. "They may want you to think that they care about you, but I can assure you they do not. People like them are determined to stamp out the way of life our family has spent hundreds of years protecting. They would see you cower before Muggles, suppress your magic for what they consider the greater good. They would see our communities polluted, our children's mind poisoned." And just like that, Sirius was no longer allowed the privilege of using the owlery. There was still the Muggle post. The large black mailbox on the outskirts of the Blacks' estate was mostly just for show, and nobody ever checked it except Sirius. He had already perfected the system of sneaking out, and knew exactly which time no one would miss him. Still, it made things a bit more difficult. He didn't know Remus's address, so he had to stop sending letters, and Remus stopped writing to him as well. Luckily, he'd learnt James's address after visiting, but the other boy was horribly confused by the Muggle post, and only managed to send one more letter during the month of July. Without regular communication from his friends, Sirius quickly grew lonely. The house was too big and too empty. He and Regulus had come to a sort of truce, which mostly involved ignoring each other, and that was only broken by the occasional fragile smile or a resentful remark. It was hard not to begrudge his brother, who still had unimpeded access to the owlery and was able to communicate with his slimy little friends. Sirius tried to picture weaselly, mean-spirited Barty Crouch sitting down to compose an epistille, and suffered a complete and total lack of imagination. But still, at least Reg was there. At least he left clean bandages outside Sirius's door. At least he looked the other way when he caught Sirius defacing one of Father's books in a moment of rage, although later Orion would know immediately who had done it, and he would not be lenient with discipline. At least Reg snuck into his room that night, and didn't say anything, just lay next to him, side by side, breathing in tandem until Sirius fell asleep. The next morning, they both acted as if nothing had happened. Sometimes Sirius wished his brother would just pick a side. It was so incredibly confusing, when Reggie was laughing with him one moment and then sneering at him the next, and Sirius was never quite sure what he'd done to flip the switch. Reg often acted sympathetic when they were alone, that their conversations would inevitably look back to the point that Sirius simply needed to clean his act up and play by the rules. And why couldn't he just stop pushing the boundaries? And couldn't he just understand that his parents were just under a lot of pressure? During one particularly nasty fight, Regulus suggested that Sirius only insisted on treating their parents like villains because it made him feel important to play the tortured hero. It was the first time Sirius had ever truly wanted to hurt his little brother. The week of the betrothal ceremony, Reg was back to being sympathetic. He could defend their parents all he wanted, but he couldn't deny that being forced to marry your cousin was objectively awful. He tiptoed around Sirius the entire week, sensing his brother's dire mood. It wasn't exactly helpful, but it was better than the alternative. On the morning of the ceremony, Sirius woke feeling numb. No matter how hard he tried to deny it, the day had finally come. He was to be betrothed, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. He briefly considered refusing to leave his bed, but he was sure that his parents would force him to get through the ceremony, even if it meant dragging him, literally, to the altar, metaphorically. He was numb as he dressed in the hideous green dress robes. He was numb as his mother yanked a comb through his hair, which he'd purposefully messed up. He was numb as he greeted the flood of relatives, all invited to witness the joyous occasion. He was numb as Regulus squeezed his hand and whispered, "It'll be okay. I promise. Just wait." He barely processed the words. Narcissa didn't even look like a real person in her dress. She looked like a character from the pages of a history book or a horror story. There was something tragic about the lace, something final about the fierce glint in her eye. They were marched to sit in front of the spectators, side by side. She was still taller than him. Sirius wondered if he'd be able to write letters to his friends from Durmstrang. His father was speaking. He wondered if there might be a way out of this whole mess once he came of age. Surely his parents couldn't force him into marriage once he was legally an adult. He wondered if he should spend more time studying wizarding marriage law. But Remus had checked out all of those books, and he hadn't found anything. Now his uncle was talking, saying something about the sanctity of tradition and hard times ahead. Sirius wondered vaguely what his mother would do if he just stood up and ran. If he could disappear into the woods, live in a cave like he and Reg had always talked about. Narcissa stood up. Sirius blinked, coming back to himself. He sat frozen, staring dumbly at his cousin. Was he supposed to be standing too? Was this the part of the ceremony? "We have to stop at once." Narcissa didn't raise her voice, but it rang clear and sharp over the crowd. The silence was a corpse, heavy and stiff. Sirius could hear his own heartbeat. What? He looked around, seeking an explanation. His mother's face was a mask of rage. Bellatrix was grinning maniacally. Reg caught his eye, smiling almost as broadly as Bella, though he was clearly trying to stifle it. What was going on? It appeared that Narcissa's father was equally as confused. He stepped closer to his daughter, hissing, "What do you think you're playing at?" Narcissa kept her chin high, mouth at a thin, tight line. She leaned towards her parents, whispering something, and Sirius had the pleasure of watching his aunt faint immediately onto the lawn. Behind them, the gathered spectators were beginning to mutter, whispering amongst themselves. Sirius watched, perplexed, as his mother stomped over and demanded to know what was going on. Narcissa turned to her, not a trace of fear on her face. "I have made an unbreakable vow." Her voice didn't even waver as she said it, staring Walpurga Black dead in the eye. The crowd fell silent, straining to hear. "What?" It wasn't a question. His mother's voice held no curiosity, only venom. "I vowed to marry Lucius Malfoy as soon as I finish my newts." Sirius felt as though he'd been kicked in the teeth. He couldn't believe that Narcissa, perfect, haughty, straight-laced Narcissa, had actually had the guts to defy their family so drastically and so publicly. It was a scandal of epic proportions, perhaps even worse than his sorting into Gryffindor. He felt as though he was seeing his cousin in an entirely new light. The silence only held a moment longer before chaos erupted. Everyone was shouting. His uncle was trying to stop his mother from attacking Narcissa, and there were sharp flashes of light, as curses were suddenly fired from wands. His parents could talk about decorum all they wanted, but Sirius had gotten his temper from somewhere. Watching the ceremony fall to pieces in front of his eyes, it was abundantly clear that hot-headedness ran in the family. He managed to slip away, dodging his relatives, to scurry back over to Reg. The two of them ducked behind the decorated statue, peeking around the side to watch as their family members screamed at each other. "Did you know?" Sirius asked, feeling slightly giddy. His brother nodded. "Narcissa wrote to me last night. Said I shouldn't tell you, that it would risk giving everything away. But I told you everything would be all right." Sirius was so relieved and delighted with the turn of events that he couldn't even find it within himself to be angry that he'd been left out. Instead, he laughed with his brother as they watched their great aunt flailing about for the hat that their third cousin had just knocked off her head. Sirius wasn't entirely sure what to expect. After the fiasco with the betrothal ceremony, he thought his parents might lock him up even tighter, level a new barrage of restrictions. He worried about Durmstrang, wondering if they'd use it as a last resort. He waited, anticipating the moment that their anger with Narcissa inevitably bled over to him. But it didn't come. Instead, his parents seemed to be ignoring him. They still lectured him, they still scoffed at his behaviour, but the vicious methods of discipline were abandoned, and for the most part they left him alone. He was even able to start using the owlery again, although neither of them had officially reinstated the privilege. They just didn't seem to care about him enough to stop him. Sirius could hardly believe his good luck. He began to understand the sudden change in attitude on the evening he overheard his parents speaking in hushed voices in his father's office. Sirius had snuck out of his room to see if he could find any will-o'-wisps in the back garden. He knew well enough not to follow them, and it was fun to watch them darting about. As he passed the office door, he paused, surprised that his parents were still awake. Very carefully, he pressed his ear to the door. "Not sure that we can just ignore years of tradition." "Oh, please, Orion. We wouldn't be ignoring tradition. There's precedent. You know it just as well as I do that he'll never be fit to shoulder the weight of such responsibility." His father sighed deeply. Sirius felt a sickly twist of nausea in his gut. He knew immediately that they were talking about him. "Regulus shows such promise. In a few years he would make the perfect heir. You cannot tell me that you don't agree." No, you're right. I truly hoped that he might mature. That match with Narcissa might... Well, I suppose it doesn't matter now. But we can't be too hasty." "Of course not. I'm only suggesting that we realign our priorities. This isn't only about their futures." Sirius returned to his room. He didn't want to hear any more. It wasn't like he wanted to be the heir. In fact, he never wanted it. It had always been such a dark cloud, bloated with lightning, waiting to strike the moment he turned 17. After all, wasn't that the source of all his grief? The only reason his parents tried so desperately to mould him into the perfect black. He didn't care about the house, the fortune, and he certainly didn't care about the stupid bloody traditions. He didn't want to go into politics or spend all his time worrying about upholding family honour or struggle to keep up appearances. No, he didn't care at all, not one single bit. So what if they made Regulus the heir? He was much better suited. He obviously wanted it, with the way he pranced around acting like the world's greatest son. He was such a kiss-up. He always wanted to be on his best behaviour, never stepping one toe out of line. If their parents said jump, Reg would ask how high. That was what they wanted, a puppet, a mindless, cowardly little git who would do whatever they said, even if it meant throwing his brother under the bus. So what if their mother doted on Regulus, smiling proudly as she straightened his Slytherin tie, smoothing back his hair with a touch that was so gentle, maternal, loving? Who cared? Sirius didn't need her. He didn't need any of them. He was much better off alone. In fact, he liked being ignored. He liked being invisible, unnoticeable, untouchable. He liked being left to his own devices, without his parents ever glancing his way. He liked that they'd given up lecturing, that they hardly even spoke to him, that their gazes slid off him as if he repulsed them. Oil and water. He liked that they forced their attention on Reg, and he obviously liked it, too, when he swallowed all the doting, but all the praise, like a pig being fattened for slaughter. Sirius didn't care. He didn't even bother thinking about it. Not even a little bit. Not one bit.